Modern Chinese History by Professor Liu Zheng. Chapter 5. Leaping Ahead, 1955 to 1960. Domestically, the decision in the mid-50s to implement a planned economy ran into steep hurdles and necessitated a significant revenue increase that was very difficult to achieve. Rural collectivization was enforced to increase revenue from the countryside, but output stagnated. Internationally, rising discontent in socialist countries alarmed the leadership in Beijing and prompted the search for a forward escape. Mao Zedong came to the conclusion that the country needed to hasten its pace on the path to communism and to intensify social transformation. The Great Leap Forward, started in 1958, was the answer. It was an attempt to deal with the accumulating challenges by mobilizing China's population to make major and sudden progress in industrialization and modernization. This daring gamble, however, ended in one of the worst calamities in modern Chinese history. Economic mismanagement and natural disasters led to a famine that killed over 20 million people. 1. Reorganizing society. The communist authorities reinstituted the household registers, which ordinarily had one page for each member of the house. That page included entries for name, birth date, occupation, place of work, family background, individual status, education level, marital status, religion, and ancestral place of origin. To be entered any time one of these changed, the head of household was supposed to change the entry in the register and report it to the local public security bureau. The head of household was held responsible for reporting all changes in the constitution of the household. Individuals were registered as members of households. In general, the household registry was deposited in the household registration section of each local police station. Based on hukou files, the police also kept a confidential list of people to be specially supervised. Hukou registration began as a tool to protect the revolution by identifying and managing suspected enemies of the government. By the end of the 1950s, however, everyone in Chinese society had been assigned an urban or rural identity through the system. Further, someone who was not registered to the hukou of an area was not permitted to reside there. To prevent rural residents from entering a city and benefiting from the valuable subsidies intended for urban residents, the right to enter had to be restricted. At the same time, the large groups of refugees and migrants already in the city had to be removed. In 1955, the government began to launch campaigns to relocate those members of urban society who were labeled as parasitic and did not have an urban hukou. Millions of people were persuaded or forced to relocate to rural villages. In May 1955, Zhou Enlai signed a directive to take the household registration system that had been in place in the cities and expand it to the countryside. With the promulgation of statutes of the PRC on household registration on January 9, 1958, this omnipresent and powerful institution was eventually given a legal basis. The statute stipulated that every citizen had to be registered at their place of residence. By the Ministry of State Security, the hukou was one of the most central institutions the new government established. It was the linchpin in the administration of urban neighborhoods, regulating access to scarce resources and entitlements based on residency. An important goal of the CCP was to address the long-standing inequality between men and women by toppling an old patriarchal order based on male dominance over women's lives. Specifically, the reformers wanted to rid Chinese society of child marriage, concubinage, and the prohibition against widows remarrying. The official discourse portrayed marriage reform as an integral part of a larger socialist project of building a productive, liberated nation. The new marriage law of 1950 was supposed to tackle those issues. The implementation of the marriage law ran into considerable resistance. However, across China, the campaign's mixed results suggested there were limits to the new state's reach. Many husbands and their families had paid money to their brides' families at the time of their marriage, and considerable financial investment was made with expectations regarding the women's work in households and fields. The possibility of divorce threatened those agreements. Under the new law, a poor man might suffer a loss from which he could never recover. Meanwhile, cadres in the countryside were hesitant to implement regulations they feared would alienate the male population. The communist government thus devoted considerable efforts at a grassroots level to educate people about the law. As women learned about their rights, divorce rates in some areas jumped higher, yet local officials often would not grant divorces, especially if family hardship could be proven. Criticisms about the lack of implementation led the party to renew efforts to enforce the law in 1953. Local cadres were instructed to strictly follow the text of the law. The consequences of land reform had already shattered the social and economic foundations of religious practices. The plots that local temples had relied on to finance their activities were confiscated and redistributed. The cadres also attacked the landlords and other local elites who would have been active in the temple associations. After 1950, no space was left for carrying out religious community festivals, but worship of ancestors and local gods continued to be carried out privately. The CCP's policy toward religion was based on Stalin's policy. State agencies regulated religious affairs and restricted the educational and welfare activities of religious organizations, and clergy were organized into patriotic associations, such as the Chinese Buddhist Association, founded in 1953, which cooperated with the government. Religious leaders who refused to cooperate were imprisoned, allegedly not for their religious beliefs, but for their counter-revolutionary activities. The most systematic suppression was directed against the millenarian sects and redemptive societies, those groups, many of which had emerged in the 19th century and grown rapidly in the first half of the 20th century. The party perceived those groups without exception as a counter-revolutionary threat to their rule. Their leaders were ruthlessly punished, often sentenced to death, and their members were forced to withdraw and cut all connection to the groups. There was also great interest in social classification, labeling, and producing new classes in society. Since the revolution, people have been categorized as members of 10 types: workers, poor and lower middle-class peasants, revolutionary cadres, revolutionary soldiers, and dependents of revolutionary martyrs, or of the black elements, landlords, rich peasants, counter-revolutionaries, bad elements, rightists, and, implicitly, intellectuals. Personal files recorded every individual's details, including those essential pieces of information, class and political background. These categories began to matter a great deal as they became the basis for class discrimination. As we have seen, the CCP intended to create a new collective subject, a modern, liberated, and self-fashioned type, the new men and women of China. Ascribing new definitions of gender roles, class, and nation was a significant part of the transformation of Chinese society. 2. Planning the economy. The CCP's economic policy, fundamentally inspired by Marxist theory, was that all means of production, including all enterprises and factories, should eventually be nationalized and operate under full state ownership. After the communist takeover, China fell into a difficult economic situation. The newly installed city administrations urgently needed funds, which they tried to raise by increasing taxes and other fees on businesses. Business owners were also forced to purchase victory bonds to fund government operations, and this diverted money that would otherwise have been invested in production. The result was a marked rise in urban unemployment. Chinese leaders looked favorably upon Lenin's new economic policy after the October Revolution, which, in key respects, provided an economic model for China's moderate policy in the period of new democracy. In the initial phase, the new government bought a number of enterprises, and some previous owners remained at their firms as managers or supervisors. Only a small number of key companies in the financial and defense sectors were outright nationalized. Private production expanded quickly in relative and absolute terms. During the period from 1950 to 1953, industry and agriculture recovered and grew to the extent that by the end of 1952, output already surpassed the highest pre-revolutionary levels. Thus, within the first few years, a mixed economy emerged in which major industries that were already state-owned coexisted with a sizable sector of private manufacturing and trading enterprises and a private handicraft industry. In agriculture, the landlords had been disowned by the land reform movement, and the peasantry, now made up of individual private property owners, dominated. In 1953, the government also extended its control over the economy by replacing previously independent chambers of commerce with the All-China Federation of Industry and Commerce. By implementing these policies, the government was able to stabilize the economy relatively quickly. CCP leaders agreed that the mixed economy should endure only temporarily. In due course, and once conditions permitted, all private ownership of means of production should be abolished. At a June 1950 meeting of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, Mao told anxious business people, entrepreneurs, and traders that the mixed economy during the period of new democracy would last 20 to 30 years. During this time, conditions conducive to a socialist transition would gradually develop. In reality, however, inter-party discussions had already modified the plan and debated the possibility of 10 to 15 or 20 years. Stalin believed China was too backward for a transition to a planned economy and that the government should continue to cooperate with private business to promote economic development. But after the consolidation of the CCP's rule, Mao Zedong started to short-circuit this long-term perspective and encouraged efforts to move forward with nationalization and economic planning. Mao began to repudiate the moderate new economic policy model. In February 1953, Mao stressed to provincial officials that Soviet methods should not be blindly imitated. He started to advocate a program of economic change. Many CCP members and government officials were bewildered and reacted to this shift with disbelief. The business community was shocked and felt deeply betrayed. Mao felt that as long as there were capitalists and market structures in China, the socialist project was at great risk of being toppled. In his speeches and commentaries, he frequently pointed out that communism would be secure only when all remnants of capitalism had been completely removed, just as the big estates and land holdings had to be liquidated in the countryside. There were, however, also very pragmatic considerations. The mixed economy, while growing quickly, had inherent problems. As the institutions of China's socialist planned economy developed in the mid-1950s, it became obvious to both party leaders and owners of private enterprises that it was difficult to maintain private production in an increasingly socialist economy. The PRC's leaders were inclined to attempt to implement socialist planning and state administration more quickly than anticipated. Despite ongoing debate within the party, Mao Zedong announced a general line for socialist transition in October 1953. This new policy declared a new phase in the transformation of the capitalist economy into socialist industrialization and collectivization. The existing economic structure based on private ownership would be replaced by a system operating exclusively on the basis of state and collective ownership. In that year, nationwide economic planning set out to develop a massive socialist industrial complex through direct government control. The plan called for a development strategy based on maximum extraction of surplus from the rural areas to fund heavy industrialization located in the cities. In 1954, China described itself as a nation developing a new economic system based on public ownership and economic planning. Since in that system, an economic plan made by a government centrally determines investments, prices, incomes, quotas, and production goals and communicates these to all units as central commands, implementation began in 1954 and continued vigorously through the high tide of 1956. The goal to nationalize all privately held businesses and industries was already achieved by 1956. As Chinese communists went about developing state industrialization plans and programs, they could build not only on the model of the Soviet Union but also on the nationalist government's experiences during the war. Several vice-chairmen of the GMD National Resources Commission, a planning agency, later served in the Communist State Council planning apparatus. The system was heavily dependent on technology and knowledge transfers from the Soviet Union. The CCP thus set up Soviet-style economic planning agencies and industrial ministries to administer the investment of anticipated surpluses from agriculture into new industries. Introducing a Soviet-style command economy presented a formidable challenge. The process of socialist transformation, from the publication of the General Line to the socialist high tide in January 1956, turned out to be rocky. China's economy was huge, complex, and very diverse. Backing up the plan was a system run by a government bureaucracy to contract for inputs and manage their distribution. In some industries, this system could base its allocations on precedents established in the Republican era. The hefty investment in strategic sectors led to substantial economic growth. After the announcement of that general line in 1956, as much as 48% of the public budget was funneled into industrial projects. The resulting increase in industrial production drove momentous gross domestic product growth. From 1952 to 1957, it averaged 9.2% annually. Total industrial output nearly doubled over the course of the 5 years, from only 17.6% of GDP to 33.2%. Heavy industrial sectors were developed that supplied each other's demands based on the government's investment decisions. By the late 1950s, heavy industry contributed 55% of total industrial output, up from 35.5% in 1952. From 1953 to 1956, new economic institutions were established by the party that replaced existing structures. This rechanneling of resources led to quick economic growth, but that effect was created not so much by technological innovation as by reallocation of labor and the redeployment of capital extracted from agricultural production. These extractive institutions, however, were not able to generate sustained technological change. Once all the resources that could be reallocated to industry had been reallocated, few economic gains were left to be made. At that point, the growth of the Chinese command economy stalled, with lack of innovation and poor economic incentives preventing any further progress. Toward the end of the 1950s, the idea of a big leap held more appeal. 3. Collectivization in rural China, 1953 to 1957. The year 1953 brought the decision to push forward with the next steps in China's transition to socialism, to abandon the economic policy of new democracy by nationalizing all remaining urban private property and industry, and to swiftly introduce a planned economic system. This development had dramatic consequences for agriculture. Mao's push for profound and quick change in the countryside was met with resistance and contested within the party. The first serious fissures of intra-party disagreement appeared in 1953. Agricultural production did not grow fast enough to generate the huge amount of capital required to accelerate China's industrial output. Mao Zedong and his supporters decided that the answer was to transform Chinese agriculture by pushing through first a program to establish cooperatives in which tools and workloads would be voluntarily shared even though land was still owned by individual households and income would be generated by selling products on the market, and second, a collectivization program so that all land would be owned collectively by peasants who would be paid salaries for their work. Collectivizing would combine China's small farmers, their small plots of land, and their limited draft animals, tools, and machinery together into larger and presumably more efficient structures. This became evident in the Gao Gang affair in 1954. Mao's accusation of two high-ranking colleagues, Gao Gang and his supporter Rao Shushi, of being traitors led to their purging. Initially trusted by Mao Zedong, Gao had been promoted in the final years of the Civil War to become the party, state, and military head of northeastern China. In 1952, he was transferred to head of the State Planning Commission of China and member of the Politburo. In 1954, Gao tried to ask Liu Shaoqi and Zhou Enlai, believing he had Mao's backing. Gao began to move against Liu and Zhou. Mao instead attacked Gao Gang and Rao Shushi for undermining party unity. It is important to understand that the kind of deep cracks the Gao Gang affair revealed were not restricted to top-level leadership. Rather, they divided the entire party and even caused rifts in society. They appeared at all levels. Within weeks after the National Party Conference, which occurred in March 1955 and proclaimed the defeat of the Gao clique, the CCP adopted active programs for agricultural collectivization and the socialization of industry and commerce. Mao Zedong had come to believe in the potential of small rural collectives to serve as catalysts in bringing about a fully socialist agricultural system. He also claimed that an organizational change in agriculture would lead to increases in output. His opinions were explicitly at odds with recent Central Committee decisions. The Central Committee had opted to delay collectivization until China had the capacity to modernize agriculture. Mao started to criticize Liu Shaoqi, Bo Yiba, the Minister of Finance, and others for these policies, asserting instead that middle and poor peasants should be encouraged to oppose rich peasants and ex-landlords. In Mao's view, only collectivization could prevent a restoration of the old order. From that point onward, Mao pressed vigorously for the expansion of mutual aid and cooperation teams in agriculture as a first step. In 1953 to 1954, farmers were encouraged to form mutual aid teams, which would work together in farming. The second phase was to turn mutual aid teams into agricultural producers' cooperatives. In the summer of 1955, Mao gave a speech on the question of agricultural cooperation and called for a campaign to accelerate the transition to socialism, wanting to launch China on an even faster developmental path. By the end of 1955, almost all mutual aid teams had been transformed into agricultural cooperatives. Seizing the moment, Mao began a campaign for collectivization in 1955 to 1956. The reorganization and coordination of peasant labor was again stressed by Mao as sufficient to bolster development. He also saw it as the only way to make progress, since rural China did not have and could not afford machinery and advanced equipment. The cooperatives were now reorganized into collectives, or state farms, in which peasants worked the land without owning it and received disbursements of grain or cash on the basis of the local cadres' calculations. With these momentous developments, the family farming tradition disappeared from rural China. Around the end of 1955, the harvest yields that had risen for 5 years flattened out, and economic problems appeared on the horizon. Agricultural output could not keep up with the demand created by fast industrial expansion or even with the increase in population. China was hit by an agricultural supply crisis and found it increasingly difficult to provide its own people with enough grain. In 1953, urban rationing had already been introduced so that the legal urban population received grain distributions from the state. From August 1955 onward, rationing was extended to the countryside, and ration cards were distributed through the household system. Even before agricultural collectives were formed, the Chinese government had established compulsory procurement of grain from peasants, creating a government monopoly over key agricultural goods. After 1957, this would include almost all agricultural products. Peasants were forced to meet production targets established by the state grain monopoly and to sell what they grew at low, fixed prices. Given these systematic biases in price settings, agriculture became an activity with low returns, while state-owned manufacturing became much more profitable. As a result, there was a steady incentive for people to leave the rural areas. Not wanting too many peasants to leave the farms, however, the government imposed restrictions on mobility by expanding the hukou system in the countryside. A dual economy emerged. After paying some of their grain in taxes and providing the quota the government demanded at low prices for its stores, peasants were able to keep what remained for their own needs. To convince the peasants to deliver their surplus grain, the state made patriotic appeals, arguing that it was needed for the economic construction of the country and the supply of the army. Many peasants, however, complained about the low purchase prices and resisted handing grain over to the state. But collectivization, and especially the unified purchase system, Tonggo Tongshao, increased the burden on every household. By unleashing a broad campaign in the high tide of socialist transformation in 1955 to 1956, China completed collectivization rapidly, together with the equally and unexpectedly fast socialization of private business and handicraft. By 1957, the majority of the rural population was organized into collectives. Mao Zedong was certainly the moving force behind the push toward collectivization. He prevailed over his colleagues who held different views by removing and deterring opponents. By the end of 1957, however, it had become evident that collectivization was failing to fulfill its promises. Agricultural productivity stagnated, and not enough was produced to fund investments in industrial development, to feed a growing urban population, nearly 100 million people in 1957, up from 60 million in 1949, to supply the raw materials, for example, cotton and oil seeds, demanded by industrial manufacturers, and to engage in the foreign exchange needed to import industrial goods. Disillusionment took hold within the party and society. Doubt spread as to whether the system of economic planning and collectivization could work properly in China. Migration from the countryside swelled as farmers, ignoring hukou restrictions, sought jobs and food in the cities. These negative developments also deepened disagreements between Mao and veteran leaders such as Liu Shaoqi and Zhou Enlai. 4. Crisis in the socialist world. In February 1956, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev stunned the socialist world with unprecedented and unexpected revelations in a speech to the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party. He disclosed at great length the extent of Stalin's brutality, terror, cult of personality, and deviation from Marxist and Leninist principles. By exposing some of Stalin's crimes, Khrushchev dismantled the image of infallibility with which the communist system had surrounded itself. That the party had strayed from the correct path for decades and that the great leader admired by communists everywhere could have been personally responsible for the deaths of so many innocent people came as a profound shock to communists and their sympathizers throughout the world. The very basis of the communist system's legitimacy was shaken. Present in Moscow on that day was none other than Deng Xiaoping, head of the Chinese delegation to Moscow for the 20th Soviet Party Congress. Deng immediately recognized the significant domestic, but also international, implications of that speech. As a consequence, it weakened the authority of not only the Soviet Communist Party, but other communist parties too. When Deng returned to Beijing and reported on the speech to Mao, Mao was immediately upset. Khrushchev's revelations deeply unsettled Mao and the CCP leadership, who realized that global conditions had changed and that, as a result, China faced profound challenges. On the one hand, Mao, who had always had an uneasy relationship with Stalin, welcomed critical discussion of Stalin's mistakes, particularly as they related to his misguided policies toward China. On the other hand, Mao believed that the Soviet Union's new course, which de-Stalinization had made possible, was mistaken. His opinion was not shared, however, by those Chinese Communist Party leaders who dreaded Mao Zedong's monopolization of power. They seized on Khrushchev's speech to welcome the new policies, particularly insisting on the principle of collective leadership. Mao Zedong was later to complain about how his views had been met with indifference by many party leaders. In 1956, the impact of a changing global situation could already be felt. In the autumn and winter of 1956, discontent caused by collectivization and the implementation of the planned economy was on the rise in China. Grievances over inadequate food supplies were widespread in the countryside. Public demonstrations for better conditions for workers, more democracy, and freedom of speech were observed and reported on by the secret police in China. Between these shocks to the agricultural system and ongoing peasant resistance, the state found it increasingly hard to enforce its grain quotas. More peasants streamed into the cities in 1957 to escape hardships in the new cooperatives and to seek employment in the rapidly expanding state-run factories, where government policy kept wages rising rapidly. All over China, tensions flared. The party was confronted with the greatest crisis since the 1949 takeover. Mao's speech on the 10 major relationships, April 25, 1956, was an eloquent, systematic, and critical re-examination of the Soviet model. He emphasized that China should not blindly follow foreign models and that it should develop its own path with confidence. Mao also described the relationship between the revolution and the counter-revolution, beginning with the observation that revolution and counter-revolution are antipodes. He predicted the continued existence of the revolution-counter-revolution contradiction in socialist society. When Khrushchev declined, China unilaterally provoked a limited passage at arms in the Taiwan Strait in 1958. Mao calculated that his People's Liberation Army attack on the islands of Jinmen and Matsu would not result in an international and possibly nuclear war. He reasoned that the U.S. government would shrink from any involvement. To the contrary, President Eisenhower threatened that if China went forward with an invasion of Jinmen, the U.S. was prepared to deploy the atomic bomb against it. Under pressure from both the Americans and Soviets, the Chinese government ended its offensive in the Taiwan Strait. This episode further strained Sino-Soviet relations. Domestically, the CCP decided, at Mao's suggestion, to launch a campaign for greater openness, the 100 Flowers Campaign. On February 27, 1957, Mao delivered a speech in which he encouraged open criticism, using the phrase, "Let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend." Having severed their bourgeois and colonial roots and reoriented themselves to a socialist view of the world, they could be trusted to usefully criticize the CCP in public. He believed by suggesting ways to correct the faults of bureaucratic rule, they could bring the party to a new and higher level of revolutionary success in serving the people. And the movement reached its climax in May 1957. In a thrilling and surprising month of public debate, many of the intellectuals and minority party leaders finally emboldened to speak out. Surprised, Mao, with the depth of their criticisms, some said the party had taken a too dominant, too powerful role and that its thirst for power was not matched by competence in governing. Many writers and artists complained of having to obey narrow aesthetic rules and being constantly harassed by censorship. Jurists attacked the legal system as feeble and demanded judicial independence from the party and a strengthening of the court system. The cult that had formed around Mao was criticized as well. In short, the intellectuals did not make the hoped-for suggestions of gradual improvements to party rule. Rather, just as in Eastern Europe, they voiced demands for more far-reaching political change, even to the extent of calling for a multi-party political system and democratic elections. Mao and others in the party were shaken and responded by quickly putting an end to the criticism. Mao launched a punitive campaign to eradicate the rightists among the intellectuals and cadres. The anti-rightist campaign took off in June and ran well into 1959. All those who had voiced criticism, regardless of their motives, as well as many who had made no criticism at all, were denounced and punished and were sent to labor camps. In all, this campaign, which Mao enlisted Deng Xiaoping to manage, branded some 550,000 intellectuals as rightists. During the anti-rightist campaign, Deng strongly supported Mao in defending the authority of the party and in attacking the outspoken intellectuals. As Mao's initiatives to deepen the revolution domestically and internationally strained China's relationship with the Soviet Union, increasingly bitter disputes and mutual accusations culminated in the Sino-Soviet split of 1960. Khrushchev withdrew Soviet advisors from China. Beginning in 1963, Mao started to accuse Moscow publicly of betraying socialism, while positioning himself as the true defender of Marxism-Leninism. China characterized the Soviet Union's attempt to dominate other socialist countries as revisionism and described Moscow as social imperialism. The split made China the adversary of both superpowers in the world at once. China increasingly stood alone and found itself in an unstable situation. In 1958, China dramatically inaugurated the Three Red Banners movement, consisting of the General Line for Socialist Construction, which Mao had launched in 1953, the Great Leap Forward, 1958 to 1960, and the Rural People's Communes, with news media spreading the message that speed is the soul of the General Line. The Great Leap Forward became the embodiment of that ideal. By the mid-50s, many in the bureaucracy started to realize that implementation of the general line threatened to overwhelm the economic system. They surmised from their daily work that it would take China a long time to acquire the necessary technical expertise for a planned economy. The attempt to duplicate the Soviet strategies of development in China ran up against significant structural hurdles and created general economic instability. Mao Zedong decided to resolve these difficulties in a single stroke by launching the Three Red Banners movement to score a decisive leap into communism. He believed China would be much smarter to base its development on the mobilization of the population rather than put its faith in top-down planning. The result of this thinking was the Great Leap Forward, designed to blaze an alternative trail and deliver China to a state of development surpassing industrial economies such as Great Britain. Despite the often stressed utopianism, the Great Leap Forward pursued two specific goals that were hardly in themselves utopian: finding a new institutional solution for China's food problem and accelerating industrialization. Meanwhile, the population was growing from 550 million in 1950 to 670 million in 1960, creating an additional 120 million people to feed. Stocks of grain dwindled perilously in the mid-50s. The natural disasters that occurred in the second half of the 1950s only made things worse. Strong party propaganda accompanied the Great Leap Forward. Official reports focused on the promises of new rural life under the People's Commune system. Cooperation through the commune organization was seen as key to tackling the problems that had burdened rural China in the past. Hence, the communes were instructed to start large water conservation projects, establish small factories, and manufacture goods that could increase rural revenue. They also promised to bring social welfare to the villages by running hospitals and schools and caring for the elderly and disabled within communities. The communes shouldered large-scale land reclamation projects and the establishment and management of hospitals, high schools, small factories, and other sideline industries. Public mess halls took over the management of food and, in some places at the beginning of the Great Leap Forward, provided free or heavily subsidized meals. The overarching social goal of the Great Leap was to reduce, through the communes, the differences between cities and countryside, between manual and intellectual workers, and between workers and peasants. By 1959, 24,000 communes had been established, consisting of between 2,000 and 20,000 households. Soon, the party came to the conclusion that those communes were too big and ineffective and split them into smaller ones. By 1963, there were 74,000 communes. During 1958 to 1960, neither economic planning nor markets were used to coordinate the Chinese economy. The result was a collapse of industrial production and an enormous destruction of resources. Useful iron and steel products were melted in backyard furnaces to produce large amounts of unusable, low-quality iron. Local people, encouraged to build such furnaces, deforested their own natural areas to find firewood and exhausted themselves in producing substandard metal. Large new construction sites also depleted supplies of cement. Economic output in the industrial sector plummeted. GDP per capita shrank by 17.7% in 1961. The economic tragedy that befell China in 1960 to 1961 was entirely self-inflicted, undoing the achievements of the 1950s. In the agricultural sector, a similar effort to increase production resulted in 3 years of harvest failures, 1959 to 1961. The Great Leap Forward intended to make the family obsolete as a unit of production and to replace it with large, modern, militarized, and disciplined formations of labor. After peasants had become organized in huge communes with mess halls, they could see that those who performed no work were fed just as well as those who worked hardest. Many mess halls ran out of food. Local party secretaries, pressured to make unrealistic promises for grain production, were forced to make good on those projections by emptying local storehouses, leaving local people to starve. The lack of rain, especially as irregular precipitation in 1959 to 1961 worsened the spreading food shortages, catastrophically struck. The situation in the countryside spiraled out of control. By early 1959, famine was widespread in several provinces, mostly in North China, and by the following year, it became a national crisis. The famine took the most lives between January and April 1960, when all grain stores were exhausted and new crops had yet to come up. After the crops were gone, rural people resorted to eating bark off trees, corn stalks, roots, bran, and wild plants, as well as insects, snakes, and toads. Others raided public granaries and storerooms, attacked government agencies, and rioted. For the most part, police and military stopped these refugees on the roads and at transportation hubs and turned them back. In 1959, Mao often seemed willing to believe the most improbable reports of success. Again and again, Mao urged cadres to speak honestly, and Mao and other leaders were probably not aware of the full extent of the famine. In October 1960, at last, Mao Zedong was handed a frank report on mass starvation in Xinjiang. Within a month, investigative teams came down to the provinces to document the death toll. It is impossible to know the number of fatalities over the 3 worst years of famine, from 1959 to 1961. Statistics compiled by mainland officials estimate that between 16 million and 17 million people died from unusual causes. Estimates by foreign analysts run as high as 45 million. The estimates considered most reliable say that 27 million to 30 million people perished as a result of the Great Leap Forward. In the summer of 1959, the government recognized that this radical agenda was creating problems and tried to enforce a more moderate version, with Mao Zedong personally directing a readjustment campaign at the Lushan Conference in July and early August 1959. When Peng Dehuai pointed to massive problems and the spread of famine conditions, Mao took it as a direct challenge to his leadership and launched an attack on Peng Dehuai and his allies, labeling them a right-deviating opportunist anti-party clique. Seeing Mao's accusation of Peng as a party traitor, no one else dared challenge the wisdom of the Great Leap Forward. The newly appointed Minister of Defense, Lin Biao, praised Mao's leadership and the infallibility of his thought at the Lushan Conference. By this point, intra-party negotiation and pluralism had all but collapsed. Any leaders voicing critical views were purged. Between 1957 and 1960, the agricultural workforce dropped by about 33 million, while the rural non-agricultural workforce increased by more than 50 million, and the urban population by nearly 20 million. These 70 million new non-agricultural workers had to be fed. The solution to this problem lay in the household registration system, extended to the countryside in 1958, which pinned peasants to their place of residence. From this point on, population policy became an important tool to relieve the cities of surplus workers and to settle those internal migrants in rural areas. The Great Leap Forward's immediate consequences were its terrible waste of assets and horrifying destruction of life, but it also had long-term effects of great significance. At the grassroots level, villagers were left to their own devices to survive famine and fight for survival. The already ambiguous legitimacy of the party was weakened dramatically by the Great Leap Forward debacle. At the same time, in terms of responsibility for the staggering catastrophe, neither Mao nor the party can be exonerated.
在本节目结束之前，如果您感到满意，请订阅本频道。您的订阅就是对我每天努力制作节目的最大支持。让我们一起传播真相，了解世界和中国真实的历史文化和现实政治的进程。谢谢大家观看。